Geology, technically, this is an earth science, which is the study of rocks or the solid substances on Earth.
Right.
And lately, as the space exploration programs have expanded, now the study of objects, the solid objects on extraterrestrial places, so Moon, for example, or Mars, would also come under geology.
Right.
So that is the broader definition. However, as we've traditionally known it, this is really the study of solids on Earth. There are two key topics which I would like to focus on. I think that will give us a glimpse into the incredible journey of Sayyidi Ala Hazrat alayhi Rahmah when it comes to this discipline of science, that is geology. So first thing, which is a special blessing of this beautiful ummah of the Holy Prophet sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wasallam, and that is the opportunity or the allowance to do tayammum.
Subhanallah.
So this tayammum is applicable in certain circumstances when water is not available. However, the definition which Sharia gave us is that tayammum can only be done with a substance which has the origin of earth. So if one understands what has the origin and that association and link with earth, then we can do tayammum with that. However, if it isn't, then tayammum is not permissible.
Tayammum being purifying ourselves in the absence of water from the substances that have the characteristics of earth.
Subhanallah. So that exactly. So if we now look at Sayyidi Ala Hazrat alayhi Rahmah, and when he comes to, question comes to him about which things it is permissible to do tayammum with. So in order to answer that question, one easy way would have been to look at all the previous research which the scholars have published over 13 centuries and give that an example. He was a taxonomist. He could classify, compile those lists and bring. But what does Sayyidi Ala Hazrat alayhi Rahmah does? In Fatawa Razawiyya Sharif, so one simple question, and he writes pages upon pages. And what does he do? He says there are 311 substances I enumerate for you. And then he says of these, 181 you can do tayammum from, and there are 130 from which you cannot do tayammum from. So look at his classification. It's not just about positive, but also the negative. So the things which ummah must avoid, because this is a matter of Sharia. He doesn't want the ummah to miss their prayers or miss their ibadah by getting into something which they didn't know whether it belonged to earth or not. So he even tells us about those. And then he further classifies them and says of these 181, that tells the depth of his knowledge. He says of these 181 with which tayammum is permissible, 74 are already published, and 107 I have added to the list. And when it comes to those substances where you cannot do tayammum from, there are 58 which are already known, and there are 72 which I have added. And after writing this, so this is a humble sheikh, a humble scholar, but he wants people to understand the significance of what he has just written down, because this is going ahead of 13 centuries of work, which all single-handedly Sayyidi Ala Hazrat alayhi Rahmah has added to that list. So he adds those things and he says, please remember this list because you will not find it anywhere else. So there's a very great dictum which goes with that when we come to scientific knowledge. When someone publishes something, so for example, I say that this, so your name is Waseem, that means I'm saying it because I know that. If I say that I know that this drug works for this particular disease, that is my knowledge, which is positive knowledge. It is much easier to say that this substance I know can work in this condition. However, if someone brought me a very rare, perhaps a plant or a chemical or something, and said, would it work for, let's say, cancer? I don't know that, because in order to answer that question, I should have known all the substances which have ever been used to treat cancer to decide whether that substance works or not. However, I can say easily whether this substance works because I have experimental evidence for that. So what Sayyidi Ala Hazrat alayhi rahmah has done, which we need to contemplate here, is that he, by the grace of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, has memorized the 13 centuries of literature, that he so authoritatively can say, look, I know that the substances I have added, no one has ever written before. So that authority could only come if somebody was a geologist who knew what the substances which have the origin of earth, and then also he knows by the grace of Allah Tabaraka Ta'ala everything which has ever been published in the previous 13 centuries. And then he doesn't stop there. So he goes further and says that he discusses of the substances he gives, he takes examples. And then he discusses the origin of those rocks. Then he discusses the location. Where would you find those substances? And then he says what are the physical properties of those stones. So he discusses all of that under that. And then what a beautiful example. So there was actually a very famous professor of mineralogy in the subcontinent. He writes about Sayyidi Ala Hazrat alayhi rahmah. He read this research and he says, I can challenge you that you can get any mineralogist from around the world, ask them to name 50 substances which have the origin of earth. I'll challenge them if anyone can write those. And Sayyidi Ala Hazrat alayhi rahmah has given 311 of those 181 belong to that. And one of those he discussed, which is very famous nowadays in the Western sort of culture, the news and everything, is about the coral.
Right.
So there are coral reefs, and especially now that we're talking about plastic pollution, which is very, it's being discussed quite a lot recently. And one of the things which plastic is polluting are these coral reefs. Right. So these are almost these untouched, beautiful stones and rocks in the oceans, which have these special properties which carry the marine equilibrium. And they are responsible for balancing and maintaining the equilibrium in oceans. Right. So that is the coral. So Sayyidi Ala Hazrat alayhi rahmah, under this discussion, also discusses about whether coral is something from earth and you can do tayammum with it or not. So the sort of thing which even a professor of mineralogy may not be able to answer, Sayyidi Ala Hazrat alayhi rahmah answers that. But again, the thought behind is that I want to help the ummah with the problem of tayammum.
Subhanallah.
And he enumerates 175 situations where water may not be accessible.
Allahu Akbar, Subhanallah.
And then he again writes that prior to this, only up to 50 situations have been written down in this literature over 13 centuries. And I'm adding the remaining, so 50 known, and he's given 175. So he's adding another 125 and says these are the situations where it's unable to access water. And then under that, he says there are 160 types of water which are okay for wudu. And then there are 146 types of water which are ineligible for wudu. So in those situations, you need to do tayammum. And here I give you 175 situations where water may not be accessible. So inaccessibility, 175 types. Previously, only 50 types known. When you have access to water, then remember there are types of water which are admissible for wudu, that's 160. But there are another 146 types which are not acceptable, and that's when you may have to revert to wudu. So classifying after classifying, compiling information, adding evidence, all of that comes naturally to Sayyidi Ala Hazrat alayhi rahmah. The final point I would like to make is one of the major human catastrophes, and may Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala protect us all from that, and that is earthquakes. Now, so it isn't strictly speaking geology, but it certainly comes under geosciences. Right. And you need to have an understanding of geophysics. You need to have understanding of geosciences. And actually, now the earthquakes themselves, they come under a separate sub-branch, and that is seismology.
Right.
So now what I'm going to tell will prove that Sayyidi Ala Hazrat alayhi rahmah was also a seismologist.
Allahu Akbar.
Question comes to him about what causes earthquakes. Right. So Sayyidi Ala Hazrat alayhi rahmah, before he explains his viewpoint in the context of deen and in the context of what Quran and Hadith teaches us. So first of all, it describes the modern concept. So that is the level of his understanding. If you are going to either provide evidence or refute something, you need to have the understanding of what is the current model which is explained. So he writes that. So he says that Earth has a crust, and we know that there are what we call seismic plates, right, which are present in various places around the planet Earth. And that's the reason why some areas are more prone to earthquakes than others. So Far East, for example, we know that there are more earthquakes there. So he explains why that is. So why some areas are more prone, because based on the current understanding. He describes the structure of the Earth. He describes about the epicenter of how the earthquake starts, how the Earth shakes, how the Earth's crust bursts open, how the volcanic motion would try and move all that steam, and with that the pressure comes out, and that when it happens in the ocean floor, that can lead to tsunamis. He explains all of that. This is the modern understanding of seismology. He explains all of that, and then he goes on to explain what is the Sharia concept and what it does Sharia tells us. And the upshot of that is what he's trying to teach us there is that this is what science teaches you, but what we also know that this is potentially is a punishment from Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. So one needs to focus on his amal, on his deeds, so that Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala's wrath he's protected from. So look at the beauty. He, again, what we discussed right at the beginning, he blends the modern science with the Islamic knowledge and says, yes, this is what science is teaching you, but remember, this is what our deen teaches us. So we can blend it to the point where it's acceptable, but then there is, what we need to remember is that we must be submissive to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. We must pray to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. We must do those deeds and actions which pleases Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, because otherwise these disasters may be a manifestation of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala's wrath. So that's how beautifully he explains seismology, but then brings it back to the science of religion.
Subhanallah.
We love Madani Channel. We love Madani Channel. We love Madani Channel.